much. Happily, a lot of the points that I was wanting to make have been touched on by other papers, and I can therefore refer to them on my way through. I've spent a very long time writing about how policy decisions get made and prime ministers and their quirks and achievements. And I wrote the chapter on the Howard government in a two-volume history of the prime ministers that I and two of my colleagues published. Volume 1 was up to the 40s and came out, I think, in 2016. Volume 2 was up to roughly Malcolm Turnbull and was published in 2017. And I wanted to talk today, and was invited to talk today, about John Howard's office, but I see it in the context of what I would call the prime ministerial machine. Prime ministerial machine. This was a term that wasn't one I invented, it was actually a term that was suggested to me by some people that I was interviewing in the course of the research, particularly public servants and people in the PMO. And I'll quote some of that later. But the prime ministerial machine is this combination of the Prime Minister's office, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the ability of those to facilitate policy and coordinate across the machinery of government. And the PMO has been an integral part of this since the 70s. The structures that have emerged started with Whitlam and Fraser developed them. Each government, that Hawke and Keating also developed them. Arguably, they reached their zenith with Howard. But I was asked too to speak about this question of anticipation, coordination, or spin doctors. This was a title that was suggested to me by the organisers, not one that I invented, but I'm very happy to talk about it because I think all of those things come out of the PMO and through this prime ministerial machine. Anticipation in the sense not only of the focus on government's policy, as I've said on the slides, but also anticipating the things that the public service can't fully engage with, the political aspects of what's going on. And Scott Prasser this morning talked about the distinction between what he called the hot and cold advice, the rational, objective advice that the public service is meant to provide, and the politically attuned hot politics that the people who can work in the PMO should provide. So anticipation is important, but coordination is also important, and I think there the relationship between the PMO and the PM&C in particular is very important, but it works across the government in turn. And of course, communication. I had a bit to say about that, but the paper this morning really covers a lot of that. But let me quickly try and talk about what I think are the strengths of the Howard prime ministerial machine. Firstly, we've heard a lot about the clarity of objectives that Howard brought to government. His program for progressive economic reform was rolled out incrementally. He demonstrated very early on the courage of his convictions, the gun control laws, the introduction of the GST, courageous decisions. He habitually introduced decisions and policy and announcements with statements of how each aligned with Liberal values and the interests of those who shared those sorts of values. He stayed constantly in touch with the party. He travelled, he talked to them. He carried the party with him in a way that few other Prime Ministers since have done. And all of this meant that, you know, people knew what he was about. The public knew what he was about. The public service, the party and so on knew what to expect. And to top all that off, as Paul Kelly has shown in a very fine essay on cabinet and cabinet discipline under Howard, he developed a very strong cabinet discipline. And not in a sort of domineering way. Paul McClintock, his cabinet secretary, said that at the heart of this there was a calm, deliberative process. I don't remember anyone raising their voices. It was very controlled, it was a respectful environment, and that's not always the case. It reflects John Howard's personal style. So that clarity was essential. Communication, I won't say a lot about this because of the paper we've heard this morning, but Howard believed that the responsibility for carrying the government's message rested with the leader. And so he engaged in what's now called the permanent campaign. He chose the means by which he thought he could best reach his audience, talkback radio and so on. Journalists were often referred to, sorry, I should flick through some of these slides, shouldn't I? Journalists were often referred to transcripts of what he'd said on talkback radio. So there was a controlled flow of information. Howard's media staff in the Prime Ministerial Office, the Prime Ministerial Office under Howard was 40, got up to 40 people. 8 of them were media advisors. That was the largest contingent to that time. The Prime Ministerial Office has remained largely that size ever since, under successive Prime Ministers. But very effective communication. Coordination of advice. I think an earlier presentation in one of the earlier conferences by Anne Tiernan talked about some of the crises early in Howard's term and how he learned from that and how the office changed. The Travel Rorts affair where he lost ministers and even his chief of staff in 97. Arthur Sinodinos then becomes a very important figure. That's when Arthur Sinodinos came on board. And he, I think, clarified the responsibilities of the office, the functional difference between the political and policy roles, the establishment of the Cabinet Policy Unit, whose head was also the Cabinet Secretary, was extremely important. It was a significant intermediary between Cabinet, the PMO and the Australian Public Service. And the success of the interaction between the PMO and the APS hinged on the relationships between the Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of PM&C. And McClintock, who was the second of those who ran the Cabinet Policy Unit, said that it was the link point between the office and the bureaucracy. Neither totally inside one or the other. We certainly didn't see ourselves as part of the PMO, but we weren't part of the bureaucracy either. We were the go-to people from each end. So that was his view of the Cabinet Policy Unit. But on that relationship, that crucial relationship between the APO and the APS, Peter Shergold, who I think is an extraordinarily able public servant and committed public servant, Shergold said there's probably no day when I wasn't in touch with one of the policy officers in the Prime Minister's office about something. And I'd have regular contact in person or by telephone with the Prime Minister. It was a strong relationship. A lot of that relationship was about policy. And Arthur, well, he was quite exceptional because he liked policy and he was interested. John Howard, said Shergold, was very clear in understanding the difference between Arthur's role and my role. He would conscientiously remind others in his office, more junior policy advisors, and particularly media advisors, of that role. So I come to a fairly long comment by a senior public servant about what I've called the Prime Ministerial machine. This was Alan Rose, not Secretary of PM&C, but certainly had a series of important departmental secretarial roles. He said if a Prime Minister comes in and doesn't understand the history of the machine, the way it's built up since Howard since Whitlam and Fraser, and then through Hawke and Keating, and so on. If they don't understand that and what they're inheriting, they're at a grave disadvantage and they're likely to be chewed up by it. Outside of the government, outside the Prime Minister's office, the media, the lobbies, they've all grown to have a particular understanding of what the Prime Minister is capable of. I don't mean personally, but what his or her machine is capable of and what they're responsible for and what they should be doing. It's not so much the character of the individual, but the office and what the office has become that dictates the way it works. Now, John Howard commanded it superbly. He knew what he was getting. He commanded it. He took it in a particular way and ran it in his way. I think Paul Kelly's paper and many others have really also given us more dimensions to that sort of summary. It's not to say that everything was necessarily terrific. The flaws in the machine, which were not created by Howard, but were there really from the first, can't be discounted. The PMO introduced under Whitlam and refined under Fraser, the problems had been there from the first. An enhanced capacity for direction and control was not matched by systematic constraints, or above all, by transparent scrutiny and accountability. And arguably, again, reflecting on some of the papers too that were given in the last couple of days, just such flaws were apparent in a number of contentious incidents which are still being debated, such as the children overboard affair, spin, arguably, the decision to commit to the Iraq war, but I think more particularly the point Paul Kelly made yesterday about the failure to have a sort of review of the intelligence background leading into that commitment, and some of the things we've heard this morning about the capacity of the NSC to also indulge in some groupthink. The Northern Territory intervention, nobody doubted the passion that Mal Brough brought to this, and nobody doubted that he'd sat down with the elders and understood them. But Peter Shergold said that they were blindsided when it came into Cabinet. It sort of suddenly appeared on the agenda. He had to ring the head of the department responsible department and say, you better get over here. And then there was a scramble. And remember, this is late in the term of the Howard government. So there was a scramble to sort of put together the cross-departmental team that would have to implement this. And then it largely fell to successive governments because it was so close to the end of the Howard term. So I think some of those flaws are inbuilt, and it wasn't that the Howard government escaped all of them. But he was certainly, I think, probably the most successful in managing this prime ministerial machine. The successor governments have, on the whole, failed in one or more of those aspects of anticipation, coordination and so on. I speak very quickly about the people leading up to Scott Morrison and the Morrison government. Rudd was captured by the PMO. In the end, it was just a very small group of people that he was talking to towards as the crisis mentality built up about his big promises on things like climate change, which he then couldn't deliver. He was only talking to these young, bright men in his office. Terry Moran said he hardly spoke to PM&C. That he, having earlier had sort of the usual regular interchange with the Prime Minister, had to virtually make an appointment with these young chaps in the office to speak to them. This was the heart of the failure of Rudd's enterprise. Julia Gillard, in contrast, was very good, a good negotiator. She was very successful in developing and carrying legislation. There were very good relationships between the Prime Ministerial Office and the public service. But she failed on other fronts. She couldn't overcome the divisions in the party, and she failed in public communication. She couldn't, like Howard, come into the public sphere and explain successfully what it was that they were all about, or respond to the criticisms that they were getting. Tony Abbott, I think again there was excessive reliance on the Prime Ministerial Office. People saw him as having a wholly negative agenda. Apart from budget repair, the sense was that he was going to tear down everything that the Labor Party had tried to achieve. But there was, again, the sort of groupthink element, the reliance on Peter Credlin, the sort of closed circle around him. The public didn't know what he stood for. Malcolm Turnbull, a bit like Rudd, he was a good public communicator, television presence, all of that sort of thing. There was reasonable coordination of PMO and the public service. He brought back Martin Parkinson, who, like Shergold, was very successful. There was some anticipation of major problems, the National Energy Guarantee, the crisis in the energy market. But that failed too. He didn't carry the party with him. He couldn't overcome the sort of divisions within the party. Very good policy activist Frydenberg put a great deal of effort into that. It all came to nothing. And eventually it brought him down. So each of those governments faced significant crises. Rudd, of course, I didn't mention, had the GFC, but also climate mitigation. Gillard delivering on what Labor promised while in minority government. Abbott, budget repair, but really no communication of what was going to happen beyond that. Turnbull building up to the energy crisis and then failing, and intensified divisions within the party. So, how are we going for time? Okay. I was going to talk at the end about Scott Morrison and crisis management and about the pandemic, which I will do when I get to write the paper up. But I think the key things were that Morrison in 2019 made himself the story. He was this formidable on-the-ground campaigner, a one-man band. And his, like Abbott's, was a negative campaign. You know, people didn't like Shorten, and it was the bill you can't afford. And that was a very successful way of doing it. But he set out to govern in the same way, as a dominant, controlling figure reliant on an inner circle with excessive concentration on the PMO, controlling the daily theatre of politics rather than and managing perceptions rather than thinking through exactly what should be done. Despite sort of knee-jerk reference to coalition staples like defence, security, the sovereignty and economic management, he seemed to be a reactive rather than a proactive leader. There was no sort of sense of thinking long-term in the way Howard had. He was preoccupied with the immediate and therefore also always seemed a bit behind when it came to challenges and what had to be done. As an addendum, there was no evidence of a significant policy agenda under development, and that became a major hurdle in the 2022 election. Well, I've written on all of that elsewhere, and I was going to relate that to the COVID pandemic, but that will have to wait for the written paper. Thanks very much.